What is the Venezuelan oil link in the India-US trade deal? Imagine a major reset in India-US economic ties where tariff, oil supply, and geopolitics suddenly intersect. This is exactly what has happened after months of mounting tensions between New Delhi and Washington. And at the heart of it lies a surprising third player, Venezuela. What began as a bitter feud over US tariffs and Indian oil purchases has evolved into a high-stakes strategic dance where Venezuelan crude has emerged as a potential bargaining chip in one of the most consequential trade deals in years. The backdrop: trade frictions fueled by oil politics. Over the past years, US-India relations were strained, primarily over trade and energy policy. In 2025, the United States slapped punitive tariffs on Indian goods, at times taking the combined levy as high as 50%, partly because India continues to import large volumes of Russian crude oil. India becomes one of the world's biggest buyers of Russian oil after the Ukraine war, attracted by deep discounts that helped reduce its import bill. But from Washington's viewpoint, those purchases were feeding Russia's economic engine at a time when the US was trying to curb Moscow's capacity to sustain its war. US leaders repeatedly linked tariff reliefs, that is, lowering the duties on Indian exports, to India's willingness to cut back on Russian oil. This linkage becomes the central negotiations point in the broader trade talks. The breakthrough: tariff down, oil sourcing in focus. In early February 2026, Presidents Narendra Modi and Donald Trump announced a new trade framework. US tariffs on Indian exports have been significantly reduced from punitives high around 50% down to 18%. India agreed to reduce and eventually cease Russian oil import, a central demand from Washington. Trump publicly said this would be compensated by India's increasingly purchases on US oil and potentially Venezuelan crude. These connections between tariff relief and energy sourcing marked a new phase in the bilateral relationships where energy policy became an explicit part of a trade agreement. Why Venezuela is mentioned? Venezuela's role in this deal is not because it's suddenly flooding India's port with oil. Rather, it appears in the strategic conversation as a possible alternative sources to Russian crude. Here is why. Crude quality: Venezuelan oil is heavier and more so, somewhat similar to the grades many Indian refineries had optimized for Russian supplies. Historical trade: India previously imported Venezuelan crude before US sanctions limited that trade. Those purchases were modest in 2024. They averaged only to about 70% barrels per day. But they illustrate a pre-existing energy link. US positioning: Trump mentions Venezuelan oil as a potential replacement when describing the deal, signaling to both market and policymakers that alternatives non-Russian suppliers exist. It is important to note that the agreement has not formally codified specific volumes commitments for Venezuelan crude. Instead, Venezuela is discussed as one of the options India might explore in diversifying away from Russia. Practical realities of Venezuelan's oil supply. Despite the high-profile mention, Venezuela's capacity to supply India is limited at present. India has nearly zero imports of Venezuelan oil in late 2025. Offers of Venezuelan crude to India are reportedly being prioritized for US buyers first under new marketing arrangements, with limited available volumes left for others. Venezuelan production remains constrained compared to Russia's prior export. Thus, while the Venezuelan options exist, it's far from a silver bullet solution to replace Russian oil in India's energy mix. Strategic and economic implication. For India, the tariff cut is a major economic relief, boosting competitiveness for Indian exporters. Energy diversification remains a priority, but logistics and refinery configurations mean any shift away from Russian barrels will take time. For the US, linking energy sources with trade concessions serves broader geopolitical goals, weakening Russian revenue streams and prompting US energy exports. For Venezuela, the mention in this high-profile deal enhances its visibility as a potential energy partner even if practical volumes are currently small or uncertain. The Venezuela oil Link in the Indian-US trade deals is not a binding supply contract, but a strategic suggestion entwined with Washington's objection to reduce Russian oil revenues and reset bilateral trade terms. It underscores how energy diplomacy now sits alongside tariffs and trades, a reflection of how global geopolitics, oil markets, and economic ties are increasingly interconnected.